Dr. Todd is a member of the 1898 Memorial Foundation, which has been working through reconciliation since 1995. She is known as a retired educator and community advocate. Dr. Todd holds degrees in administration and supervision, educational administration and supervision, library science and biology from both East Carolina University and North Carolina Central University. Her work has been documented in published books. Additionally, Dr. Todd has served as an assistant principal for John T. Hoggard High School in New Hanover County and has served as a human relations trainer for both New Hanover County Sheriff's deputies at Roland Grice School in Wilmington. Dr. Todd has also served as a career development coordinator, a librarian, and a secondary summer school principal. She's also completed a large amount of consultant and professional work. Her presentation today will be a great kickoff for the start of our community conversations. These dialogue sessions will deal directly with the Confederate monument. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Archie for his comments. And again, let's welcome Dr. Todd here to Rocky Mount.
First of all, I want to thank the community for coming out and supporting us on this project. This is a large project. It's a challenge. It's something that's going to take the whole community. And I thank you for coming out and being a part of this. I hope you're with us for the journey. It's going to be a journey, but it's something that we know is going to move us forward. The Human Relations Commission is ready and has taken on the challenge, and so they are with us today. I want to introduce the members of the commission. These are the key leaders that are going to help the Human Relations staff take on this task. We have with us Ricky Pitts, stand up, and Cynthia Cobbs, Musa Shahade, Sue Battle Moore, John Tobias, Lucy Taylor, Nehemiah Smith, and our co-chair, Williams, Linwood Williams. Is he here? Okay. And Mary Wells also is a co-chair, but she had another engagement with the county commissioners. And we have a new member just appointed, Cornelius Dancy, in the back. We also have with us who will be assisting with the commission, a couple of members from our MLK Commission and a Males Commission with Personal Disabilities also. So we thank you for your commitment to this community. And I want to thank the mayor, thank the city council, and thank the city manager's office for their support. And then also there are going to be some community facilitators that's going to join us in this process. And I want to go ahead and thank you beforehand also. So with that said, I will turn this process over to Dr. Todd.
Your commitment to moving forward. My commendations to the city officials, elected officials, for your moving forward goals. You're also to be commended for hiring the first female city manager. I'm commended on that. And I'd like to say to you that I've known her since she was a little one. My daughter and Rochelle went to YWCA camp together. And then Rochelle is a graduate, of course, of John T. Hoggard High School, where I was assistant principal, and we had plenty of riots during school desegregation. I also have with me today my friend, my personal assistant, my chauffeur, my secretary, my housemate. She is better known as my daughter. Rita, will you raise your hand? Rita is a retired educator who's a graduate of UNC Chapel Hill and UNCW Wilmington. She retired in 2010 after teaching 30 years in the North Carolina public schools. Currently, and I laugh about this, she has a part-time permanent job in one of the most devastated schools, elementary schools, in New Hanover County. But I think, I may be prejudiced, she's doing a very good job. Now, How many of you are natives of Rocky Mount? Okay. How many of you are elected officials? Okay. How many of you are members of other organizations? Okay, thank you. We have a diverse group. I would also like to say to the Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated members, thank you for one corsage. I'm a member in Wilmington. And I would like to say thanks to the Links, the chapter of the Links in Rocky Mount. Wilson, Rocky Mount, Tarboro. How could I forget? You're one of the earliest chapters. I know the histories of both very well. The purpose of this presentation is to assist you in becoming acquainted with the history of New Hanover County and the city of Wilmington. I shall review the process that we have implemented many times in working with the controversial issues of New Hanover County and Wilmington, North Carolina. I think we have many more than you may have. Well, I'm going to start with 1660 and give you a brief overview. The town of Wilmington at that time formed a large part of one of the 13 colonies. And the colony of Virginia and those members, you know what they said about Wilmington? As the home of the renegades. The citizens of Wilmington during that time ran away the Spanish ships. Many immigrants moved there. Population then was 1,000. Now I want to tell you, I know all of you have heard about the Stamp Act, haven't you? Well, guess what? Guess where the resistance started? In the town of Wilmington. Wilmington was not considered a state yet, nor even a city. Started there. They were mad at the British, and they said no taxation without representation. They even took the British royal governor, put him, after he escaped to a ship on the port, Cape Fear River, they took that British royal governor, put him in a chair, rolled him around town on exhibit, and then burned him in effigy. That was the town of Wilmington. And this is what the Virginia, I don't know why they kept picking on Wilmington. This is what the Virginia people said in the colony. A quote, "The resistance to the Stamp Act was and well known throughout the American colonies, but the highest place of honor must be given to the men of the Cape Fear." They even honored them for beginning the no representation to the British. And of course, they just didn't like the royal governors, and we had the Revolutionary War, and that all ended. And we know Abraham Lincoln was elected, and we had the Civil War. Population then was 17,350. Schools for black and whites were built. However, between 1890 and 1899, following the Civil War, just 33 years, we found in Wilmington a paper, a daily newspaper called the Daily Record. It was run and edited and owned by a man called Alex Manley. Now, Alex Manley and his siblings were the offsprings of the Governor Charles Manley of North Carolina and his mistress. I forgot to bring the paper, the picture of Alex Manley. I did meet his nieces in 1999. You may not have heard of a lady called Rebecca Felton. She said, and she was from Georgia, her husband was a legislator from Georgia. And this is what she said. She was quite a speaker. She said, I tell you what, we must look after our white women, whether they're poor or rich. Because if we have to lynch niggers, she said, a daily, 1,000 daily. Well, I think the relationship between Governor Charles Manley and his mistress was consensual. So Alex Manley, before that, simply decided he was going to respond to Rebecca Belton's speech in Georgia. And he wrote an editorial for his own paper. At that time, the Daily Record was the only black newspaper owned by a male or female in the United States. That was the only one, the Daily Record. And of course, he did write the editorial. And no one read it. They read it, but no one objected to this. Now, I don't know if you've heard about fusion politics, 13 years after the Civil War. The city of Wilmington, the town of Wilmington, was considered the black bourgeoisie place. There were more blacks in Wilmington, more learned blacks in Wilmington than whites. We had the wealthy whites, we had the not so wealthy whites who were wheat farmers, and they were called populists. And of course, most of the blacks at that time, and some whites, were Republicans. Quite a twist now, but then, that's because Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, and he was president during the Civil War. Well, they really became more politically astute and decided that they were going to win some elected positions. You know what they did? They said, listen, if we not so wealthy whites and those of us who are black and black bourgeoisie, if we fuse together with the populists and the Republicans, then we are going to win. And you know, they did around 1894 and 1896. And they felt good about themselves. I even read where the members of the black bourgeoisie, females, were pushing the white females off the street, and that was not right either. But they served as elected officials during this time. Now let me tell you who did not like this at all. The wealthy white Democrats, not the farmers, not the populists, not so wealthy whites. They did not like what was happening. And they decided to do something about it for the 1898 voting. First, they brought up Alex Manley's letter, his editorial. Then the militia came in from Fayetteville, North Carolina. And then there was, no, the militia was right there, sorry, the red shirts. They were called red shirts because they originated in South Carolina and they were wearing red shirts. Well, they went around the town intimidating the Republicans and those with the fusion politics. They were determined. They were not going to let them be elected another time. What was the response to that? The Democratic machine revved up. The Republicans were gleeful, but trying not to show it. They were running the city. And the vigilance of the paramilitary organizations really got into action. In November, month of November, these militia and these red shirts did everything they could do to frighten. They went door to door, telling the people, you better not vote. This is what we are going to do. And when they decided to really do this, guess where they went first? They went to Alex Manly's newspaper and burned it down and told him they wanted him to get out of town. This is on the eve of November 10th, 1898. Well, since Alex Manly really was the son of Governor Charles Manly, they couldn't tell if he was white or black. And interesting enough, when I met his two nieces, when we had this symposium at UNCW in January of 1999, this is what the story they told me. He had his top hat on, he had his horse and buggy, and he was on his way out of the city of Wilmington. The red shirts stopped him. They were delivering rifles to all of the whites. And they said, have you seen that Negro, Alex Manly? And he said, no. He tipped his hat. Do you have a rifle? And he said, no. Well, let us give you this rifle. And if you see him, you shoot him on sight. And he said, thank you, I will. And he got out of town undercover. Some of his white friends had given, I learned that later, a code that when he came to the guards or the militia, all he had to do was give them the password. And he knew the password. And in the dark of night, he and his family slipped out of town and moved at that time to Virginia. That's what his nieces, both of them are dead now, but that's what his nieces told me about Alex Manly. Now, we had a banishment of whites and blacks throughout the city of the county. Many whites and many blacks were run out of town and told, do not return. And they did. And there were many other blacks who were killed and thrown in the Cape Fear River. Now, what were the effects of this violence? Massacre. Complete change for blacks and some whites. I've met some whites, the descendants of some whites, who later came to the commemoration. I've met some blacks, their descendants. They did not return. Property was lost by blacks and whites. Businesses, because blacks had a majority of the businesses at that time, were closed. The population in Wilmington dwindled greatly, and it's never been that again. Unfortunately, even when I moved to Wilmington from Durham, there were no black elected officials in 1952. And when we did get a black elected official, the newspaper said that this was the first elected official to city council since 1898. Thank God we've broken that record now. And we are in the process of trying to build. But I said this is about voting. You will see this clip that Rita and Mark's done a good job with. I don't know what we would have done without him. But they will show a clip that was made with people throughout North Carolina regarding the voting process.
The vote is the most powerful instrument ever devised by man for breaking down injustice and destroying the terrible walls which imprison men because they're different from other men.
There are people who died for the right to vote. There are people who got their heads beat in on the Edmund Pettus Bridge for the right to vote. We cannot turn back. We have to keep going forward.
Tough new measures mandating that voters produce photo identification.
16 states have passed or enacted a variety of poll access laws.
There is what looks very much like a coordinated effort among Republican legislatures and Republican governors to pass laws making it significantly harder to vote.
Democracy NC, the NAACP, and voting rights groups across the state believe that the new voting legislation is a response to the upsurge of minority and youth voting in the 2008 election. They're organizing to stop these measures from becoming state law.
Our right to vote is sacred. Our right to free and fair elections is sacred. But right now in North Carolina, our rights are being threatened.
One measure pushed by North Carolina legislators would force an estimated 450,000 active voters to apply for state-issued photo ID cards. Another would make it harder to register and would limit the amount of time the polls would be open. At the same time, North Carolina's lawmakers are refusing millions of dollars in federal funds to buy voting machines and keep voting locations open.
They are trying to stop, steal, and segregate the power and the potential of the black vote.
The new laws would disproportionately reduce voting among low-income people, African Americans and Latinos, young people, and seniors.
We are a multicultural, multiracial society. That is who we are as a people. If you want to have a government that reflects the people and serves the people, you've got to have a multicultural, multiracial government.
While sponsors of North Carolina's proposed voting laws claim we need them to curb voter fraud, opponents point out that fraud is rare and argue that the real reasons lie elsewhere. They urge us to remember that today's campaign to limit the right to vote echoes one that took place over 100 years ago. Decades after the Civil War, a mortgage crisis, an economic recession, and a changing economy helped spur a surprising multiracial coalition in North Carolina. It set voter turnout records and elected an unprecedented number of African Americans to public office. A huge step forward in opening the doors of democracy to all, it met a hostile reaction that swiftly shut those doors.
During Reconstruction, there was a general collapse of the economy, and a lot of people are poor in North Carolina, black and white, from 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, and by the time you hit the 1890s, there's a real outcry for a need for change.
White farmers began to look to black farmers as possible political allies against the banks and the railroads and the rising New South industrial state. It was a really remarkable experiment in its historical moment in interracial democracy. This fusion coalition won every statewide election. It won the governor's race. It won both United States Senate seats. It never lost an election. It could not be beaten at the polls.
Nearly 1,000 African Americans were elected to county and city offices.
You have African Americans who had previously been powerless within the political context. Now they were emerging as a force with power.
The fusionists placed a 6% cap on the interest rates that banks could charge farmers. They returned vital decision-making powers to local governments. And they taxed the railroad barons and industrialists to pay for an emerging public school and university system.
African Americans coming out of slavery really wanted a viable public education system because they saw education as really crucial to advancing their interests after emancipation. And so fusionists come in and actually direct money to education. This is seen as a big, huge, incredible deal for not only African Americans but poor whites in North Carolina.
Nowhere was the fusion movement more successful than in North Carolina's largest city at the time, Wilmington.
You could see that this is what the New South could become at the beginning of the 20th century. African American children were graduating and going to college and being architects and engineers and doctors and attorneys, and they were coming back to Wilmington and doing these things, and it all stopped in 1898. It just stopped.
Wealthy landowners, merchants, and white supremacists identified with the conservative party of the day, the Democrats. With support from the Raleigh News and Observer, the Democratic leader, Furnifold Simmons, launched a relentless campaign to demonize African Americans and drive a racial wedge between them and their white allies.
To break up this interracial progressive coalition, the white conservatives, they hire propagandists, they bring in a cartoonist from New York City to show images of the black beast rapist, the incubus of Negro domination. Which was this idea that the closer that a black man gets to the ballot box, the more he looks like a rapist.
White conservatives accused fusionists of voter fraud and government corruption.
So they're creating this sort of sense of a crime wave, and they're locating that on African Americans, and they're using this as a way and justification to explain why Democrats need to retain control.
And so these cartoons ran pretty regularly in the newspaper. And we have to remember that not everyone in 1898 is literate. And if you couldn't necessarily read the entire newspaper article, you could see a cartoon and get the gist of what they're trying to get across in the paper.
In the run-up to the 1898 elections, Democrats organized vigilante brigades called Red Shirts, who patrolled the streets, menacing both white and black voters.
The white leadership made a point to have business owners tell their employees, particularly if they were black or if they were Republicans, that if you register to vote, you will lose your job.
Democrats in that period are very open about saying, look, if we're going to win, we've got to make sure people don't vote.
The Democrats swept the 1898 elections. Still, the Wilmington city government remained in the hands of the fusionists, but not for long.
Wilmington was an armed camp. The Democratic Party leadership were putting guns in the hands of every white man they could find. They were giving them whiskey. They were putting them in rallies, and they were empowering them, and they were instilling this fear of African Americans in them.
Tensions exploded over a bold editorial in an African American newspaper. A mob of 2,000 stormed the paper's office and burned it down.
They started out in the morning and marched troops into the black community and began to shoot it up, to fire just indiscriminately into the black community, causing thousands of people to flee their homes out into the woods.
The conservatives then rounded up both black and white fusion officials.
With 500 or 600 whites, all armed, and they would bring in each elected official one at a time and bring him into the middle of the crowd and sit him down in a chair, and was told, you have a choice. You can resign and leave, or we'll kill you. And then as each one of them resigned separately, they then appointed a white to take that person's place on the city council. They then marched them out right down to the train station and put them on a train.
At the end of the day, hundreds of civic and business leaders were put on trains never to return. Documents show that at least 22 African Americans were murdered, but the real death toll remains unknown.
It's the only successful coup that the United States has ever seen.
Back in power, the conservatives aimed to ensure that no such reform alliance could ever rise again. So they constructed legal barriers to make it difficult, if not impossible, for African Americans and poor whites to vote.
said nothing about race. It didn't say black folks can't vote. It said literacy tests. It was neutral language. The grandfather clause, if your grandfather had voted, then you didn't have to take the literacy test. So, it was all colorblind.
At the height of fusion, 126,000 African Americans were registered to vote in North Carolina. 2 years after the Wilmington coup, the number of registered African American voters shrank to 6,000. North Carolina's voting laws suppressed the vote for decades and blocked all kinds of reforms. In 1920, at the peak of the women's suffrage movement, Furnifold Simmons, still kingmaker of the Democratic Party, warned of a revival of fusion if North Carolina allowed women to vote. One congressman cautioned that, just for the sake of letting a few agitating white women vote, the women's suffrage amendment would enfranchise 110,000 Negro women. Tar Heel lawmakers refused to ratify the amendment, even as women won the right to vote in other states. Barriers to the vote remained until passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Again, there was a reaction from conservatives. Over the next few decades, thousands of Democratic office holders across the southern states fled their old party to become Republicans, turning it into a nearly all-white political party.
Now, I'm sorry that some of you had votes suppressed in the past. I understand that.
For House Bill 351, a bill requiring that voters provide photo identification before voting.
Today, there are no red shirts menacing voters like they did in the fusion years. But conservative lawmakers again fear a surge of new voters. Again, they want to rewrite election laws to limit participation. Their anti-voter bills would repeal same-day registration, shorten early voting, end Sunday voting, and more. The justification echoes that of the 1890s.
Why? Because in the past two elections, there have been hundreds of voting irregularities. Cases of double voting and absentee voting, fraud.
Yes, voter fraud. Take Ohio. A statewide survey of votes cast in 2002 and 2004 found that out of 9,078,000 votes, there were 4 instances of fraud. That is a jaw-dropping 44 1/millionths of 1%. Folks, our democracy is under siege from an enemy so small it could be hiding anywhere.
People have to push back against this kind of nonsense.
We're saying that these folks, the representatives in here, some of them, the leadership, are out of control. Out of control.
It's a tool for them to reduce the number of eligible people that can vote. The groups that are affected, in some ways it's the same groups that were affected 100 years ago. Voting and democracy at its core is about bringing more people in. That's what Democracy North Carolina is all about.
North Carolina's anti-voter bills are hanging in the balance. History shows us that those who can seize the moment will shape our democracy for generations to come.
Mantle has been passed. We are at this point, we're at this precipice. Do we want America that should be but has never been? Now it's time to go forward. If you don't do it, accept what kind of consequences happen to you because you just rolled over and you just let it happen. I'm, for one, am not going to let that happen. I'm going to fight till I have my last breath to try to make things better.
These laws aren't designed to keep those Democrats from voting. They're designed to keep the wrong people from voting.
Why do we have these campaigns saying we have to get all the young people to vote? Young people often don't know anything. Let's stop saying everyone should vote.
In 1995, some university professors, black and white, community citizens, black and white, members of other organizations said that Wilmington has had this skeleton in the closet for almost 100 years. What are we going to do about it? We banded together. I had just lost my older sister and my spouse at that time, so I had no intentions of participating. And when the gentleman who initiated this effort, he was a professor at UNCW, and he was supposed to be bringing the university and the community together. Well, he did. And he wrote his first letter on UNCW stationery. Well, now, ladies and gentlemen, we have some descendants in Wilmington now. I won't call their names, they're in the book, Moving Forward Together. And there was another book, Cape Fear Rising, written by one of the instructors at UNCW. Those descendants of those wealthy whites took him to task. This was before we began in 1995. Cape Fear Rising is the book. It was supposed to have been historical fiction. Having been first a media specialist, there's no way in the world you can write historical fiction and then put down the real names of the individuals in the book. Well, this is a book that will be available to you. This was printed in 2008 as a result of our culminating the goals of the 1898 Memorial Foundation. Well, I tell you what happened. The wealthy whites, some of the Keenans, and the Murchisons, and the others who supported Chapel Hill, who supported UNCW, had just given the university $1 million. And they said if they had read Cape Fear Rising, written by one of the instructors at the university first, UNCW would never have gotten that $1 million that time. They took him to task and really tried to fire him, but they couldn't. You know about the freedom of the press and the freedom of religion and the freedom of speech. He had tenure, but they did get rid of his wife. Now, when the man, Dr. Bolton Anthony, who lives in Chapel Hill now, asked me if I would help him, I said, Bolton, I'm sorry. I've been through school desegregation. I've been through this. I'm grieving. I don't want to be bothered with this controversial event. Well, he left me alone for a while. But the 1898 First Centennial Foundation required, when they organized, you have one black and one white co-chair of the foundation, and one black and one white co-chair of every subcommittee. One doesn't move without the other one. And the young man who was a co-chair for Bolton, Dr. Bolton, left him, he was a lawyer, and left him, moved back to Pittsburgh. So here he comes again. I said, Bolton, I will serve as an interim until you can find someone. Well, I did not realize Bolton wasn't even looking. So I ended up in an activity that I worked on. Very few of us worked for 13 years. 13 long years. That's how we discovered the city of Wilmington has the controversial distinction of having had the only successful coup d'etat in the United States. And these individuals, they won that election of 1898, but they were so anxious, they could not wait to be installed in January. So as the film strip said, or the partial film there, they just went to each office of white and black, populists and Republicans, and said, okay, clear out your stuff. We're taking over. And that's what they did. So when I became the co-chair of the group, and they agreed with me, they knew about the turbulence. They knew about the schools and the thinking at that time. We used high school students for sit-ins. And an Episcopal minister, priest, is the one who would bail them out, Father Curtin. Anna Burnett, one of the teachers at Williston, and several other teachers at Williston also helped with that. Now, what we have done, and also, I think it was in the 70s that the YWCA had as its national mandate to eliminate racism. The Y in Wilmington was the very first agency to have worked together and integrated the white Y and the black Y. Of that I am very proud. And we went to Winston-Salem, 2 white females and yours truly, to get a grant from the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation. Spent the night. And he didn't okay the first one, approve it. But he said, you folk in Wilmington are having quite a bit of trouble with school desegregation. I was at the school that had a riot about every week. And, but by that time, I had helped to avert a riot at Williston Senior High School that spring. So I did have some information, and I learned some skills regarding riot control. That was my first initial challenge with riot control at the black high school after the assassination of Martin Luther King. But by the time I got to Hoggett and we were having one maybe once a week, I knew what I was doing. I knew how to sort of avert them. But we did a lot of study circles with the Y in the 70s. We've been doing study circles everywhere, trying to get blacks and whites together. You can't have it unless you have blacks and whites in a group. It's not too well implemented if you just have one side of one ethnic group. The YWCA did this for a long time. I met one of my best wealthy white friends, and when I became co-chair, I went around to all of the individuals whose forebears were the initiators of this coup and massacre. And I talked with them one-on-one. I did not know when I really knew some of them before then. The Taylors, the Walker Taylors, the Murchisons, the Camerons, the Roundtrees. And I talked with them, and I said, now this is not a gotcha thing. We want you to participate. We want you to be the ones to say, we have faced the skeleton, and now we're going to move on. We're going to move forward together. And one of them called. I had known him some other place. He said, well, Bertha, what do you think I ought to do? I said, George, I can tell you one thing, no Walker. We're going to dissolve after this is over. Now, if you want to get on this train, you better. And because you will regret it later. And I was really asking for money. I left and went somewhere. When I got back, Walker had placed his $1,000 under the mat, the mat, and I picked it up. But we are candid, we are optimistic, but we're positive folk. Respect another's point of view. And I even worked together with a Klan member when we had the large Human Relations Commission. And you know what we were voting on? To name the building the Martin Luther King Center. And Tex Gross, the Klan, was right along there with me. We learned to respect each other. Now let me tell you what I have written down here. reconciliation continues. We always developed a core group of leaders, elected officials, community leaders, and citizens. When we began in 1898, we went to city council, we went to the county commissioners, we went to the Board of Education. They sent representatives. City council gave us some money, county commissioners didn't give us any money, but they sent some representatives. And we let them know, I think the Chamber of Commerce gave money too, because we knew it was going to take money to get that memorial, as well as efforts we were using to implement. We secured a professional public relations firm. We had a human relations commission there then. We developed and implemented study circles. Same thing I did at Hoggett High School when it was desegregated and the teachers and the students were not trained or no meetings were held for them so they might better adjust. And we had speak outs. We had discussion groups. And those white students and black students yelled at each other. I had a white counterpart with me. And we laid down some rules that they had to follow while they were talking with each other, like respect the other's point of view. And the first year I was at Hoggett, we did speak outs. The second year, I've forgotten what I called them. I have to look at my own book that I wrote to find out. And the next year, we had discussion groups or issues. 3 different years, we worked on trying to get those students to look and respect each other as human beings, children of God, and listen to what each one had to say. Nobody was blaming anyone. Now, we do have some Confederate, oh, by the way, include pastors too. Can't do without the pastors. No. We do have some Confederate monuments in Wilmington. I'm sure those of you visited have noticed those. But right now, there's a core African American Heritage Commission group, one of the extended city council organizations, who is busy putting up markers about different accomplished blacks and different bits of information about people like Alex Manley. Dr. Schober's been there a long time. And all of those things have been approved. Now we're getting ready to work on one for Joseph McNeil. So we're not, it's history, folks. We're matching the white history and the Confederate bit with what blacks have done. Can you deny we were in slavery? Can you deny the Jews were in slavery in Egypt, led by Moses? It's history. I'm not saying what you do. I can't tell you, I'm telling you what we are doing. This is my restless journey. I've been sort of restless. And the other one is moving forward together. But these are my closing remarks. And they're straight from the heart. These efforts require a profound commitment, perseverance, positive and diplomatic actions, a respect for others' points of view, and a whole lot of prayer. I wish you well and best wishes in any controversial endeavor that you may decide to undertake. We are still in the process of reconciliation, and that is not a revolutionary effort. It is a process of evolution.